Hey guys, welcome to another installment of Hilliard at Home. Today's topic is humanism, which is a very broad term that describes the predominant philosophy or worldview from the Renaissance period up to the beginning of the 20th century. We'll look at a timeline of humanism in just a bit, but first let's get a sense of what the idea of humanism is. Humanism is the idea that human beings, individually and collectively, have agency and should have the freedom to exercise it. Agency is a really important vocabulary term when thinking about literature, literary theory, and philosophy. It means the capacity for action, or the power to change the conditions of one's existence, or to shape one's own destiny. So, with its deep faith in human agency, humanism is an optimistic view of human progress achieved by unleashing the full potential of the human individual. In other words, it's the idea that we can build better societies and better lives by giving people the freedom and resources to explore and learn about the world around them, and then act on what they've learned. So, in times and places when humanist ideas hold sway, we generally see a lot of emphasis on education and exploration. We also tend to see a lot of emphasis on literature and the arts, because it's through the arts that we really explore and communicate about human nature and human experience. In terms of religion, we tend to see more of an emphasis on the individual's spiritual experience rather than just submission to church authority. And in terms of politics, we tend to see the emergence of liberal and democratic ideas that, again, stress the empowerment of the individual rather than submission. So all of these things sound really great, right? And I'm sure that we would all describe ourselves as humanists to one degree or another. In fact, it may even be difficult to imagine what it might mean to not be a humanist. But there are some non-humanist ways of thinking out there. I think it's helpful to split these non-humanist ideas into two broad categories: anti-humanism and post-humanism. Of course, anti means against, but post just means after or beyond. So, anti-humanism is the idea that some or all humans either have no agency or should not be allowed to exercise it. I tend to think of anti-humanism as coming in two forms. Religious anti-humanism is the idea that human destiny is controlled by a higher power, and it's useless and/or sinful to resist. So, for instance, some Christian denominations, in the past and maybe even still today, have taught the doctrine of predestination, which is the idea that God decides a person's fate before they are even born. So any attempt to resist or avoid that fate is sinful and brings only disaster and damnation. Hierarchical anti-humanism is the idea that some segment of the human population is incapable or unworthy of governing itself and should therefore submit to the authority of another segment of the population. So, for instance, authoritarian forms of government usually stem from the idea that most people are ignorant or debased and must be ruled by one person or a small group of people who are, for one reason or another, superior. Other forms of hierarchical anti-humanism include racism, which is the idea that some racial groups are naturally entitled to rule over others, and patriarchy, which is the idea that men are naturally entitled to rule over women. So, hopefully none of us are anti-humanists. But I'm guessing that many of us, and maybe all of us, have ideas that correspond to some degree with post-humanism, which does not reject the idea of human agency, but understands it to be limited and complicated by the fact that we are shaped by the social, political, and historical constructs that we inhabit. We do have some power to change those constructs for the better, but even our notions of the better come from those constructs themselves. In other words, we have no pure or unbiased standpoint from which to judge or act upon the world around us. That's a pretty complicated idea, but if you've ever seen the film The Matrix, starring Lawrence Fishburne as Morpheus and Keanu Reeves as Neo, you might have some idea of this type of complexity. Check out this scene where Morpheus starts to explain the Matrix to Neo.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice. Tumbling down the rabbit hole?
You could say that.
I can see it in your eyes. Do you believe in fate, Neo?
No,
Why not?
because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
I know exactly what you mean. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it.
The Matrix.
The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church. when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. But when you're inside, you look around, what do you see? Businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters, the very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of that system, and that makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it. Were you listening to me, Neo? Or were you looking at the woman in the red dress?
In that clip, we see that Neo rejects the idea of fate, or religious anti-humanism, because he wants to believe that he controls his own destiny. He wants to believe that he has agency. But Morpheus reveals that Neo, like everyone else, has always been plugged into a system that shapes his very understanding of reality, and therefore any decisions he might make. So, like the businessmen and lawyers that Morpheus describes, Neo is not really an independent agent. He is an agent of the system. Once he understands how his mind and perceptions have been constructed, however, he gains the ability to act in ways that disrupt the system. Now, in the movie, that system is actually a computer program, and Neo is able to get outside of the program and manipulate it in spectacular ways. In reality, however, the system is made up of all the institutions and social frameworks that shape our experiences. There's no getting outside of that. We can never access some pure truth that is not shaped by our social and historical environment. But that doesn't mean that we're totally helpless. Most post-humanist philosophies suggest that the more we understand about how the so-called system shapes our experiences in our minds, the more power we have to disrupt and alter the system in ways that make it more humane, just, and equitable. We can never create a perfect system, but we can always work toward a better system. So, post-humanist ideas are not exactly against humanism. They just offer a much more complex understanding of human agency. At the end of this video, you should see an in-video link to a full segment on post-humanism. But for now, let's get back to humanism to get a sense of its historical development. So here's that timeline that I mentioned earlier. The humanist worldview has its roots in classic Greek and Roman culture, which was in its heyday from about 500 BC until about 500 AD. Prior to this period, during what is sometimes referred to as the archaic period of Greek culture, people tended to hold to the anti-humanist belief that one's fate is controlled by the gods, and all one can really do is try to please the gods and endure their arbitrary decisions. For instance, if you've ever read Homer's famous epic, The Odyssey, Odysseus is basically tossed around by the gods for 10 years and has to find ways to survive long enough to make it back home. The Odyssey was written around 800 BC. By 500 BC, however, we start to see the emergence of a more humanist worldview. This was demonstrated in the philosophical works of Plato and Aristotle, which advocated the pursuit of human knowledge and enlightenment. It was also seen in the flowering of artistic forms like drama and sculpture. This was the period when famous Greek tragedies like Oedipus Rex and Antigone were written and performed. During the same period, Greek city-states like Athens were also experimenting with democratic forms of government. When the Roman Empire emerged as the predominant power in Europe, it had its roots in many of the advancements of Greek humanism. Philosophers like Lucretius, Cicero, and Seneca stressed the importance of civic duty over religious devotion. Leaders like Augustus Caesar worked to modernize cities with well-planned road and sewage systems and other public works that improved the overall quality of life. And Roman art and architecture celebrated the vast potential of human achievement. But around 500 AD, the Roman Empire fell, and this initiated the medieval period when Europe was divided into many smaller monarchies that relied largely on the support of the Catholic Church, and the humanist ideas of classic Greece and Rome faded away. Between the monarchies and the church, medieval society was organized as a very rigid hierarchy, which was fundamentally anti-humanist. A hierarchy is any system or organization in which people are ranked one above the other according to status or authority. And a rigid hierarchy is one in which those in higher positions wield a great deal of power over those in lower positions, and there's little or no opportunity to move up in rank. In medieval society, hierarchy was seen as the natural order of things, and the world was often represented as a great chain of being. A massive hierarchy with God at the top, the angels below that, then people, then all of the creatures, plants, and even minerals in a descending order. In this famous medieval engraving of the great chain of being, you can actually see that God, at the top, is holding a chain that runs down the center of the engraving and connects to the top of Satan's head at the bottom. This larger chain of being was understood to be reflected in the hierarchical order of human society, where people were born into particular stations that they would occupy for their entire lives. This 15th century painting represents the medieval hierarchy of human society, with the Pope and his cardinals and bishops at the top, a king and his noblemen and knights in the middle, and a collection of peasants and lower-level clergy at the bottom. So again, the great chain of being represents a very rigid hierarchical structure within medieval society. To maintain this hierarchy, things like literacy and education were reserved only for those in higher stations, because education can make those in lower stations dissatisfied with their positions. So, for instance, the Christian Bible was printed only in Latin rather than in the people's own languages, so that they would be dependent on the priesthood for their access to religious knowledge. In addition to keeping people ignorant, it was also important that they remain in awe or fear of those above them. For this reason, there was a lot of emphasis on grandiose ornamentation and pageantry. So, for instance, if you were a lowly peasant encountering this massive Gothic cathedral, or this stately medieval castle, you would be so awed by the magnificence of these structures that you would never even think to question the superiority or authority of those who ruled from within them. And finally, as you might imagine, any form of literature or art that did not directly support the hierarchy was regarded as degraded and sinful. So in short, medieval society was organized along very anti-humanist lines and tended to suppress the pursuit of human potential through learning, exploration, and expression. But in 1453, a really important event occurred in what we now call Turkey. This event was the fall of Constantinople. Constantinople, which is now called Istanbul, was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which was the last remaining piece of the Roman Empire. It's a complicated story, but when the Roman Empire fell about 1,000 years earlier, it was really just the Western Empire that fell, and the Eastern Roman Empire became the Byzantine Empire. So in Constantinople, there were great libraries and universities that held many of the remnants of classic Greek and Roman culture, and there were many scholars who studied those texts and artifacts. But by 1400, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to almost nothing and was ready to be swallowed up by the Ottoman Empire, which, as you can see from this map, would cover much of the Middle East and North Africa. So even before Constantinople fell in 1453, many of those Byzantine scholars of classic Greek and Roman culture began fleeing to Italy, bringing many of those texts and artifacts with them and sparking a resurgence of humanist ideas in places like Florence, Venice, and Milan. This was the beginning of the Renaissance period, when many people began to question the anti-humanist ideas of the medieval period. One of these people was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a young Italian nobleman and scholar who was deeply influenced by classic Greek and Roman philosophy. When he was only 23, Pico delivered his famous Oration on the Dignity of Man, which is often referred to as the Manifesto of the Renaissance. So remember that whole chain of being thing? Pico had an interesting idea about that. He said that while it was true that the universe was organized in this hierarchical way, God waited to create man until after he had created the rest of the chain. Consequently, there is no specific place on the chain for man, and man can rise or fall along the chain depending on his own efforts. So, according to Pico, any man who engages in things like learning, exploration, and the arts can rise to the level of angels and even higher, while men who never engage in these kinds of enlightening activities can fall to the level of animals or even vegetation. As humanist ideas like this began to spread, they began to have a huge impact on Renaissance-era Europe. The invention of the printing press brought learning and culture into the homes of the masses. This included the Christian Bible, which began to be printed in languages like German, French, and English rather than just Latin. Scholars like Galileo, Copernicus, and Francis Bacon sparked a scientific revolution. This was also the age of discovery, when explorers like Magellan and Columbus circled the globe. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo created masterpieces inspired by classic Greek and Roman works. Poets and playwrights like Petrarch, Edmund Spenser, and William Shakespeare began to explore the human condition in new and powerful ways. And an emerging middle class began to question the feudal economic structures and monarchical political systems that defined the medieval period. So these were all important humanist developments that set the stage for the Enlightenment period, which is also referred to as the Age of Reason. During this period, philosophers like John Locke, David Hume, and Benjamin Franklin put the nail in the coffin of medieval thinking. They had a lot of new ideas about the source of human knowledge. John Locke famously put forth the idea of the human individual as a tabula rasa, or blank slate, meaning that we are born without any form of knowledge beyond basic instinct. Enlightenment philosophers also rejected the idea of revealed knowledge, or knowledge delivered to certain individuals from on high. This meant that all human knowledge comes from observation and the use of reason. They argued that a benevolent creator gave all humans the faculties of observation and reason so that we could discover truths about the world around us, and in doing so become morally and intellectually enlightened individuals who can contribute to the overall progress and prosperity of our societies. Thus, these Enlightenment thinkers considered it sinful and contrary to human progress to restrict anyone's ability to explore the world around them and use reason to become a better, more useful person. These ideas led to a growing movement toward more liberal and democratic political institutions. In fact, the framers of the U.S. Constitution were disciples of Enlightenment philosophy and understood the new nation as a grand Enlightenment experiment in creating a political union based on reason. Probably the most important literary development of the Enlightenment period was the rise of the novel, which was seen by many as a vehicle for in-depth explorations of human nature. The real explosion of literary and artistic creativity, however, would have to wait until the emergence of Romantic thinkers in the late 18th century. During this period, Romantic philosophers in Germany, France, and England argued that while reason is a useful tool for navigating the world around us, the key to higher and truly transformative types of knowledge is imagination. For Romantic thinkers, reason allows us to understand what is, but imagination allows us to see and create that which should be. In fact, some Romantic philosophers argued that imagination connects us to divinity and allows us to participate in the divine act of creation, which is something that happens continually rather than just in some distant past. In England, these Romantic ideas led to poetry celebrating the power of creative individualism, and often nature as a source of inspiration for creative action. Some of the key British poets of the period were William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, and John Keats. The later Romantic period saw the emergence of American writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Herman Melville. Now, finally, we have the Victorian period, which is most closely associated with the latter half of the 19th century. The Victorian period still exhibited a lot of humanist thinking, but it also saw the emergence of the type of skepticism that we see in post-humanist thinking. It was kind of a time of transition. So even though Enlightenment thinkers and Romantic thinkers disagreed about whether reason or imagination held the key to truth and progress, they both agreed that a benevolent creator designed humanity with a set of faculties that would gradually lead us to truth and progress. In other words, they generally understood humanity as God's chosen instruments for bringing about a utopian future. In the latter half of the 19th century, however, this type of utopian optimism became harder to sustain. For instance, archaeological discoveries revealed that the world was much older than humanity, making it harder to believe that humanity was meant to be at the center of things. Darwinian evolutionary theory suggested that human nature is not the product of divine intention, but rather of a series of accidental developments through the natural processes of mutation and natural selection. There were also world events that seemed to show that the pathway to progress was not so straightforward or linear as people might like to believe. For instance, despite the noble intentions of those who fought to end slavery in the U.S., the massive carnage of the Civil War failed to produce an era of racial justice. During the Victorian period, then, there was still a humanist faith in the power of human agency, but there was also a sense that the optimism and idealism of earlier periods had prevented people from engaging fully with the actual realities of the world. During this period, then, we see the emergence of literary and artistic realism, which was an attempt to portray the world without romanticizing it or imposing any kind of false optimism on it. For instance, realist painter George Bellows sought to portray urban American life in all of its raw detail. Here is one of his paintings titled The Cliff Dwellers. And here's another titled Men of the Docks. Some of the main realist writers of the Victorian period were Americans William Dean Howells and Henry James, Gustave Flaubert in France, and Henrik Ibsen in Norway. Like George Bellows, these writers sought to portray everyday events without romanticizing them. Now, this may sound a lot like a post-humanist perspective, and it's definitely moving in that direction. But the key difference between realism and post-humanism is the idea that our perceptions give us direct access to the world as it really is. You remember Neo and the way that his perceptions were shaped by the Matrix? A truly post-humanist worldview rejects the idea that there is any such thing as pure perceptions or ideas that are not shaped in one way or another by our social conditioning. A realist, by contrast, believes that our perceptions do give us direct access to the world as it is, and if we accept those perceptions without indulging in any kind of false optimism, we can work toward a true or pure form of progress. So, if Romanticism represents humanism in its most spiritual and transcendent form, realism represents humanism in its most rugged and material form. But they both believe that unleashing the full potential of human agency can lead to real progress and prosperity. So that concludes our discussion of humanism. You can find the PowerPoint used in this video on eCourses, and you should also check on eCourses for any quizzes or discussion boards related to this video. Thanks for watching.